In the year 1860, the most pivotal presidential election in U.S. history was won by a rather unlikely candidate named Abraham Lincoln. He belonged to a radical new political party whose main objective was to bring an end to slavery in America. Lincoln wanted to unite America, but his victory would spark a revolution that was going to split the country in half. Lincoln now had to finance a war of epic proportions, and at a time when the U.S. had no Federal Reserve, no national currency, and no standing army. America's saving grace would come in the form of one of Lincoln's rivals. His name was Salmon Chase, and he was about to redesign America's banking system and use economics to win the war. This is the story of the contrasting economic circumstances that decided the outcome of the U.S. Civil War and the dirty politics that would immortalize Lincoln as America's most stoic leader, and Chase as an envious small man, jealous of Lincoln and infatuated with becoming the president. The Civil War was going to be set in motion 60 years before Lincoln's election, with two seemingly unrelated decisions made by then-President Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson was going to outlaw the international slave trade in the U.S., and this meant that no new slaves were going to be brought to America. The domestic slave trade grew in both size and operational infrastructure as a direct result, and from this moment until Lincoln's election, debates around slavery would only grow more contentious. Jefferson's second decision was the Louisiana Purchase. This had begun an era of territorial expansion that would see the U.S. almost triple in size over the next 60 years. This growth was primarily achieved through purchasing land from European powers an ocean away and winning wars with indigenous occupants in America's way. The outcome of both meant that new states needed to be developed quickly, and so Congress had to come up with fast answers to big questions, like would the U.S.'s new states be slave states or would they be free states? Up north, slavery was rapidly turning into an unprofitable venture as a wave of industrialization had turned the North into a manufacturing-based economy. Unlike plantations, factories offered scalable employment opportunities, causing the demand for slave labor to diminish. Yet down south, it was a very different story. Slave labor was the bedrock of America's largest financial asset, cotton. The lucrative cotton industry had turned the U.S. into a global economic heavyweight and made the South America's wealthiest region. For Southerners, slavery was about economics. For the North, it was quickly becoming about ethics. But in order to contribute meaningfully to the debate shaping the issue of slavery, both sides had to disguise their true intentions and make the debate about something else: the Constitution. Specifically, the constitutionality of slavery, and even more specifically, the constitutionality of who was allowed to say what the constitutionality around slavery was. Now, constitutionality refers to the quality of being in accordance with a political constitution, and because the United States is founded by their constitution, much of U.S. political history is just people fighting over exactly what the Constitution does and doesn't say, and oftentimes, political agendas promote the debates that underscore the constitutional questions. Our story's forgotten hero, Salmon Chase, now finds himself defending two runaway slaves in front of the Supreme Court. And Chase argued that the absence of explicit reference to slavery in the Constitution meant that slavery was a states issue, and that the federal government could not require free states to cooperate with slave states to ensure the return of runaway slaves. Chase's argument captured the attention of people across the country, and he soon earned the nickname Attorney General for Fugitive Slaves. Chase ultimately lost the case, but he relished in the notoriety, and after becoming unsatisfied with his legal practice, Chase began to crave the respect and power of politics. This prompted Chase to, in 1848, start the Free Soil Party, a new political party dedicated to abolishing slavery. And while Chase was building this new party, Lincoln was about to learn what was wrong with the old ones. Lincoln had just been elected to his first term as a congressman, and while in Washington, D.C., Lincoln was disgusted by what he had seen from the slave trade in the nation's capital, and immediately began working on a deal that would end the slave trade in Washington, D.C. Unfortunately, our first-time congressman couldn't seem to get any traction. The two relevant political parties in America at this time were the pro-slavery Democrats and the we're too smart to agree on anything Whigs. Provoked by Lincoln's proposal, Southern Democrats insisted that stopping the slave trade in the nation's capital would result in the same fate for the individual states. If Congress didn't stay out of this issue, the South warned, a war might be brewing. With tensions running high, the Whig Party then told Lincoln not to run for re-election, and in 1849, a deflated Lincoln retired from politics. At the same time, Chase, running under his new political party, was preparing to win his first Senate election. As the two men passed each other through the rotating doors of Congress, the United States had just won the American-Mexican War. It was time for Congress to decide whether the new U.S. territories acquired in the war were going to be slave states or free states. The year was 1850, and Congress responded to the arguing with the not-so-innovatively titled Compromise of 1850. The compromise decided that California was going to be a free state, ensuring that the U.S. consisted of one more free state than slave states. The nation's capital, Washington, D.C., was going to permit slavery but stop the slave trade. And Utah, Texas, and New Mexico were going to be able to decide for themselves whether slavery was permitted. The South were now using Chase's own argument against the Northerners and argued that slavery was a state issue and federal intervention was unconstitutional. The North was furious, as they felt allowing new states to choose for themselves would result in the expansion of slavery, which it totally did. But really, the most highly contested part of the 1815 Compromise was the Fugitive Slave Act, which mandated that authorities in free states were required to assist in the return of runaway slaves attempting to seek freedom in the North. The North, having experienced firsthand the economic inviability of slavery, now had the luxury and clarity to concern themselves with an even more powerful consideration: a sense of morality, which was now severely being challenged by the Fugitive Slave Act, which even imposed penalties on civilians who aided in the escape of slaves on the run. Northerners referred to this law as the Bloodhound Act and insisted that it disregarded their political and philosophical views on slavery and in fact coerced them into enabling the South's sins, requiring everyone to play the role of slave catcher. As the newest senator of Ohio, Chase adamantly argued against the Compromise of 1850, but as he was neither a Democrat nor a Whig, Chase did not have a large enough piece of the political pie to evoke change. Meanwhile, America's westward expansion was increasingly putting pressure on Congress to find another answer to an entirely different 30-year debate: where to build the Transcontinental Railroad, America's greatest infrastructural project. Economic infrastructure refers to capital-intensive, large physical assets that provide essential services or facilities to a country, contributing to a shared sense of economic prosperity. Everyone in America agreed that a railroad connecting the two coasts of the U.S. was a necessary investment for the economy, but no one could agree on the route it should take. A northern route would encourage the expansion of the industrial economy, while a southern route would enable the expansion of slavery in America. After the Compromise of 1850, everyone had had quite enough compromising, and this was a stalemate no one was willing to budge on. Then in 1853, the unorganized territories of Nebraska needed to be settled, and the South saw an opportunity to force their political agenda into America's quickly evolving future. The South mustered all the political leverage it could, and by just a handful of votes passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. This act of law would relieve Congress of its responsibility to deliberate on the issue of slavery altogether, and instead empowered the states to exclusively regulate slavery themselves. The Kansas-Nebraska Act immediately resulted in outrage across the country. A retired Lincoln did not comment for months, until one day he gave a passionate speech where he said, "While the Kansas Act claims to be indifferent, I must say, it seems its purpose is the spread of slavery. I cannot help but hate it. I hate it because of the monstrous injustice of slavery itself. I hate it because it deprives our Republican examples of its just influence in the world." With that speech, the Kansas-Nebraska Act had successfully gotten Lincoln back into politics. And while Lincoln's political career was about to restart, Senator Chase was already writing America's history. In a direct response to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, Chase was going to start a new political party, one that did away with economic and constitutional rhetoric and just drew a clear line in the sand. Chase would help create the Republican Party, and its main objective would be to end slavery in America. What came next was the presidential election of 1860. Chase, along with other abolitionists, are running as Republicans, but in an ironic twist of fate, Chase, a favorite at the start of the election, lost the nomination of the party he had created to a lesser experienced, lesser known Abraham Lincoln. This proved to be the final straw for an increasingly frustrated South, and what came next was the Civil War. As Lincoln's presidential victory unfolded, South Carolina was the first state to try and split from the increasingly not-so-united states. Their declaration of secession spoke volumes to the cotton states of Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, who all soon joined the Revolution. Lincoln didn't even have soldiers, and he immediately petitioned Congress to approve the creation of a federal army of 500,000 men. But building an army was going to cost money, so in a dramatic twist, Lincoln then appointed Chase, his political rival, as Secretary of the Treasury. Everyone, including Chase, was shocked, but Lincoln knew what he was doing. Lincoln's banker once exclaimed, "Don't tell me you're putting Chase in your cabinet. Chase thinks he's a far great deal bigger than you." Lincoln, well known for his depth, patience, and wit, responded, "Well, do you know anyone else who thinks they are a great deal bigger than me? If so, I'd like to put all of them in my cabinet." Chase, who did think he was morally and intellectually superior to Lincoln, was now tasked with growing the nation's revenues, shaping economic regulation, and devising fiscal policy amidst an imploding country. By 1860, the North's era of industrialization had left Chase with a well-structured economy to draw from. The North had been producing 90% of the nation's manufactured goods, and boasted over 100,000 factories, more than 6 times that of the South. This meant that the North was filled with working Americans, and in a response to the war, Lincoln and Chase introduced the country's first ever income tax. Now, income tax might seem novel today, but given how contentious the topic of the federal government was in the politics leading up to this was actually quite a bold move, and a crucial tactic for the North to increase their revenue during this expensive war. On the other hand, the South had an agrarian-based economy that relied on exporting cotton to Europe. If the South was successful in seceding from the US, it would have been the 4th richest country in the world. But rather than innovate, the South had scaled their economy through further exploitation by requiring more of their slaves. Between 1801 and 1860, the amount of cotton the average slave was required to collect in a day saw a 400% increase. In 1791, there were 1 million slaves working in the South to produce over 2 million pounds of cotton. Operations grew exponentially, and by 1860, there were 4 million slaves working in the South to produce over 2 billion pounds of cotton. But the South's arrogance had bred disillusionment. In 1861, the North initiated a blockade across the Atlantic coastline. Unable to stop it, the South had one last chance to sell off a significant supply of cotton to Europe. Overestimating the weight of their hand, the South did nothing, assuming that Europeans would feel the strain of the cotton supply being cut off and would thus intervene and help the South win the war. But Europe actually had a surplus of cotton, so the help never came, and the South's slogan, "Cotton is king," proved to be an empty fallacy as cotton exports plummeted by 95% the next year. The South quickly raised money, selling state bonds to the British. Most of the money was wasted on undelivered ships stopped by the Northern blockade. This prompted the South to waste even more money buying back their own bonds in an effort to artificially raise prices and trick European investors into believing that the Southern economy was stronger than it was. But in reality, the Southern economy was crumbling. Taxes weren't a viable source of revenue for the South, as the largest labor force was slave labor, and paid labor was a negligible source to draw from, as 40% of the South's wealth was held with 1% of plantation owners. It now seemed as though the economic visions that prompted the Civil War were determining the outcome. And what would happen next is the North and South were now going to issue new currencies, and in hopes of outspending one another, print ridiculous sums of money, ensuring both sides experienced historical levels of inflation. Chase is about to unite the country around its first federal currency and lay down the foundation of the United States dollar. But still unsatisfied with his accomplishments, and despite being in the middle of a war, Chase was plotting his political ascent to the presidency. As the Secretary of the Treasury, Chase appeared to be exchanging political favor and access for unwavering loyalty, as Chase was building a secret society of America's most elite politicians, bankers, and businessmen to support him in his bid for the presidency. In the second part of this episode, in the middle of the war, Chase is going to run for president in the 1864 election, running against Lincoln, his fellow Republican, and the man who appointed him as the Secretary of the Treasury.